Hi, my name is Tyler Mowry, and welcome to the Writer's Mind Podcast, episode 62. All right, welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, what I want to talk about is some simple tools that you can use to keep your story clear. So recently, this past weekend, I was talking to the members of the Practical Screenwriting course in one of our weekly group Zoom calls. And we had another great discussion. I always love talking to everybody there. It's very encouraging. And one of the things that we discussed was some simple things to show that your story has a clear problem in it. So one of the things that I have found is that for most stories, like 98%, let's say, especially if you are before your first draft or if you are still honing this idea, you're not in that polishing phase, then there are usually a few big mistakes that you could be making, right? Most of the core mistakes that you're going to make are not complicated. They are very simple. And if you can understand a few of these rules, they can allow you to clarify what is and isn't working in your story quicker so that you can then move faster through your initial drafts. So one of the things that I have found is when there's a couple clear things that from the start you can use. So once you are right out of the initial sort of idea phase, right? When you're initially coming to a story, come at it from whatever angle you're going to come at that story from, right? So if you have a scene, you have a piece of music, you have a philosophical conflict, you have a character, take whatever that piece is and then do some brainstorming, whatever brainstorming you want to do. This is your initial creative flow. You're not doing a lot of editing here. Initial creative flow. How would I want it to start mainly? What are my main characters? What is my philosophical conflict? You run through those things. Then, once you have that general just idea, you don't even have to have an outline at this point. It's just you're getting some pieces together. This is the first point where you can bring in the editor in you and say, okay, now let me ask myself a few important questions that will help me put this story on the right track. Remember, I don't know if you watched my video on my main channel. That was your ego in the creative process and creativity versus editing. And if you haven't, definitely go watch that because I'm talking about a very similar idea. So once you have brought in the editing side of you, there's a couple of important questions you want to ask. Number one is, what does my protagonist want? Right? It's a very simple question, but it can immediately help you clarify to see if there is just an immediate driver of your story or if you need to give your main character that initial engine, right? That forward momentum. Aaron Sorkin talks about intention and obstacle. One of the things that he nails down very quickly in his stories is that his protagonist has a want, their intention, what they want to get to, and an obstacle in front of them very quickly, right? So what I would say is a similar idea. You want to know what your character wants. What is their goal specifically, not just ethereally or philosophically. It's important to know what they want philosophically, of course, but you need to understand what the actual plot events are going to be of your story, right? So if your character wants to win a competition or get a job or get a particular relationship, whatever their want is, what is their external want? And then we need to talk about the other side of this, which is, why is this want valuable to your protagonist? In other words, what are the stakes of the story? So what happens if your character doesn't get what they want, right? Because if it doesn't matter, if they don't get what they want and everything is fine, then you have a problem because your story doesn't have stakes. There's no reason that the audience wants to come alongside you and your protagonist to see whether or not they get what they want if there's nothing on the line. And so on the stakes side, now we can really start to build in and external stakes, and we can also start to build in philosophical stakes, right? So if your character wants to climb Mount Everest, let's say, okay, my character wants to climb Mount Everest. Clear, plot-based want. Okay. Now, what happens if they don't do that, right? So now we can look at the different levels of that. There can be an external problem of if they do not achieve this externally, they will lose sponsorships, or they will, some sort of extra, their kids will leave them or whatever, right? I don't know. I'm just literally spitballing here. So then you can look at the philosophical side of this. Okay, so if your character doesn't climb Mount Everest, they will believe that they are a true failure in life and that they were not born to do anything great. And so now this is where, on the stakes side, you can really start to embed the philosophical conflict of your story into the plot, right? Because now we're starting to attach the external actions that happen specifically to what your character believes about themselves, what they believe about the world, and what the external thing that they're doing affects their vision of themselves philosophically and their vision of the world philosophically. And so then, suddenly, now we have the drivetrain of our story. Our character wants to climb Mount Everest. If he doesn't, he believes he is a complete failure who is never able to do anything great, right? Very simple, right? So now what you can do is you can take this idea and say, okay, this helps me. This is a metric or a principle that I can use to help me move faster through some of the pieces of this story, because obviously your character should have a want and there should be something on the line. And we can, if you want to debate want and stakes, you can debate that with someone else, because that if you are creating a story where your character does not have a want and there is nothing on the line, then you and I are just not on the same page about general storytelling, and that's fine. You can do what you want, but listening to me probably is not going to help you. So now you can say, okay, these are clear rules. Ooh, people hate rules, don't they? Rules that I can now come back to and say, okay, I'm referencing this every time I'm starting a new story. What does my character want? What are the stakes? So this is why you can actually build principles and build systems to help you move through a story faster. It's one of the things, Dan Harmon is the creator of the Story Circle, which is something I also reference a lot. And one of the things that he talks about is that he uses the Story Circle to quote, well, not quote, but what he essentially says, paraphrased, is he uses the Story Circle to help break through the initial elements of storytelling that are essentially the same each time. So it allows him to move faster, get an understanding of, okay, my character needs a want, they need to go after this particular goal, there needs to be something on the line, I want it to move in this way. All of that happens because you have principles set up to help you carry through that. And so rather than constantly rummaging around in the dark, you can clearly understand, okay, what do I want to happen here? This is how I know stories should operate. So I'm going to take the ideas that I have in this brainstorming phase, and now I'm going to take the time to send them through these initial principles that will get me started. So on the other side, we can talk about understanding some signs that your story isn't working. So if you aren't sure, well, first off, if you can't clearly answer what does your character want and what are the stakes, if you can't clearly answer that, then there's a problem in your story, right? So some of storytelling is really just answering clearly to a question. And this is actually something I go even further on in my course, which is I literally have a worksheet that all you have to do is just answer the questions that I have. And if you can't clearly answer one, then I would suggest that is potentially a part of your story that isn't working and could be worth examining further. So write this down. Ask yourself, what does my character want? And what happens if they don't get it? What happens if they do get it? What are the stakes? If you can't clearly answer that, your story's already not working. So, and that's fine if it's not, but let's get it on the right track. So if you still are confused, there's a lot of reasons that your story could still not be working, right? This isn't the only part of your story, of course, but it's one of the first things that you want to nail down. And so I think if you want to look at some other signs that your story isn't working, one of the things that I see a lot of writers get hung up on is their concept, right? So whatever their genre is, is this a thriller? Is this a comedy? Is this, whatever that might be? And is this a time travel story? Then they get stuck up on their concept, and then they start getting away from not only the philosophical conflict, but also simple points like, what does my character want? It's like, oh, well, it's this multi-dimensional time travel story where this happens and this happens and this happens. It's like, okay, that's cool. I love cool concepts. What does your protagonist want? Oh, well, this happens to them, and then it really gets interesting because this thing happens. It's like, okay, what does your protagonist want, though? What is their goal? Well, they don't have a goal as much as they are experiencing that. Okay, now we have a problem because now we're really not looking at stories the same, right? So if you are spending 80% or more of your time on your concept, odds are your story isn't working, because this is what happens. People start brainstorm. Okay, here's my concept. What are all the cool ideas, the cool scenes that can happen within this concept? And that's fun. And I'm not telling you to not do that, but if that's all you're doing, now you just have a concept and a jumble of events, and that's not a story. So, and coming back to the idea of your want, you know that your character does not have a strong want if things are happening to your character rather than your character happening to things, or your protagonist. So things happening to your protagonist rather than your protagonist happening to things, right? So events are happening. So if you are describing your story and you say, my character is here, and then this happens to them. So, okay, that can be an inciting incident. What happens next? And so then they meander along, and then this happens to them, and then this happens to them, and then this happens to them. This means that there is no driver of your story. What you have is a character that we're watching and events coming at them, whether those events are things that happen or characters interacting with them. And that's a problem, because it is So here's really why it is a problem. Not just that it is not as entertaining, it also doesn't actually allow you to have a real philosophical dilemma. Because for us to understand who your main character is, they must take action. And for us to understand who they are, they must make choices. And for us to understand who they are, they must be challenged by the things that happen in the world and then take action to challenge back so that we see, okay, this is the choice they make, this is who they are. So if you don't have an active protagonist, it is a lot harder to have an active philosophical dilemma. So again, another thing that can be a sign that your story is not working is that you cannot clearly define what's at stake in your story, aka what happens if the protagonist fails, right? So you might have a clear drivetrain of story momentum. It might be very obvious what your character's want is. What does your character want? They want to win the fight. They're a boxer and they want to win the boxing match. Clearly that's what they want. It's like, okay, we're watching them, but we never get a sense of what's at stake. If they don't win, do they externally, do they not win the money that they need to provide for their family? Okay, we need to know that, because that is an external stake. If they don't win, then they believe that they are a washed up has-been, and that means that, what's the philosophical belief? My life is over, right? That could be the philosophical belief. So if I lose this fight, it means I'm washed up, which means my life is over. That's the way of viewing themselves, the way of viewing the world. Therefore, I will, my life will be pointless or wasted or whatever. So you have to know what's at stake. And you can't just know what's at stake externally. You have to know what's at stake philosophically. You have to know that when this goal happens, this want is achieved, this is or isn't achieved, this is what it will say, or this is what my character will think. And then ideally, over time, your character goes through, either they go through change and then their perspective on this goal could change, or they get to the end of the goal and their perspective is what they thought it would be earlier, whatever. But you need that relationship. You need something to be on the line. I think a lot of stories fail there because they have a want, but the story kind of becomes black and white in the sense of we don't really know our protagonist. We don't really know our antagonist. We just know this is the goal. They're fighting. This is what our character wants. And so once you clear out the distractions in your head, once you stop getting so caught up in your concept, or stop getting so caught up in how many locations that you have to shoot, or stop getting so caught up in how many pages that you need to write, or all of this noise, you can start to really define, okay, let me just get to the simple points of this story, the simple core things that the entire rest of the story is going to be built off of. And when you know that, and you know the reason that you're telling the story, and the reason can ideally come from you having something to say philosophically that you are imbuing into this story, and then having the audience watch it as it unfolds. Now you can build everything off of that. And so then suddenly ideas like writing principles don't have to be scary, because you understand that you're making these decisions because they allow you to get the thing that you have to say out to the world in the most clear way, in the most impactful, meaningful, emotionally valuable way. So I hope that's helpful for you. And I want to leave you with this. Seriously, a lot of storytelling is more simple than you think. But people get complicated. They let it get complex in their heads, and they want to come at a story every single time without principles that they have learned from previous story. Don't walk into a new story without arming yourself with the lessons that you learned from the last one you wrote. Come into the new one with that clarity. Come into that new story knowing that, okay, I need to get these 3 things right. So I'm going to brainstorm, and then immediately I'm going to answer these questions, right? That is going to allow you to write so much faster, to write with more clarity, and to find and fix your story's problems easier. So I hope this is valuable for you all. I'll see you guys next week.